You're listening to Missing Persons, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, DNA ID, Zodiac Speaking, Scene of the Crime,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
Citizen Detective, and
Campus Killings.
All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
The views and opinions expressed by guests on this podcast do not necessarily represent those of the podcast, its creators, or sponsors. If you would like to discuss a missing persons case on this podcast, please be sure to visit missingpersonspodcast.net. This episode may contain unsettling or disturbing subject matter. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Missing Persons, a podcast dedicated to spreading the word about people who have vanished under mysterious or unexplained circumstances and the family members who are looking for answers. I'm Jess Betancourt.
And I'm Mike Morford. Together we created this podcast to help give a voice to people who continue to search for their missing loved ones. In some cases, even after decades have gone by. In each episode, you'll hear from Jess giving listeners the backstory and the basic facts of the disappearance.
Then Mike will speak with someone who's intimately connected to the missing person, and his guest will share their story with us.
Please stay tuned at the conclusion of this episode to hear about our Patreon program and our commitment to help find people who have gone missing. We'll also share with you where you can find more information and how you can join our team and help our efforts. You'll get recommendations for other podcasts we think you'll enjoy and more.
So sit back and enjoy this episode, and who knows, maybe you can help us find someone who's missing. Episode 69, Judith Ann Brown. Judith Ann Brown was 19 years old when she was last seen on or around April 6th of 1977. Judith grew up in New York and as a young woman was quiet and shouldered a lot of responsibility taking care of 7 siblings. Her father had been severely injured in an accident, and her mother worked to support the family. Judith's family was close with their first cousins, one of whom said that Judith became withdrawn and somewhat odd in her teen years. When she was in her late teens, Judith's family with all 7 of her siblings relocated to Kansas. Judith didn't want to go. She wanted to remain in the city she had lived in for her entire life. She moved in with an aunt, Gina Drew, and her cousins in Queens, and attended LaGuardia Community College. But Judith had some mental health issues and was in counseling. She had an episode one day at school, a nervous breakdown or panic attack. And on August 3rd, 1976, she committed herself to Creedmoor Psychiatric Center. After 2 days, her grandparents transferred her out of Creedmoor and she became an inpatient at the mental health center Hillside Medical Center, formerly known as the Long Island Jewish Medical Center. It wasn't far away from Creedmoor. After 2 or 3 months, Judith moved into the hospital-provided housing and began outpatient services at Hillside. The family believes that Judith met Richard Riesenberg during her few days at Creedmoor. He was a resident there. Judith wrote to her parents that she met him at a bus stop, but it's unclear whether this was true. It's believed they started dating in August 1976. Riesenberg was 11 years Judith's senior, and knowing what we now know about him, it seems likely that he was easily able to manipulate the vulnerable, young, and inexperienced Judith. Judith wrote numerous letters home to her family in Kansas in which she mentioned Riesenberg. She called him her boyfriend and said he made her happy. In one of her last letters, she said they were engaged and planned to be married in the Unitarian Church. Nothing in her letters indicated that Judith was anything but content, and there was no indication that she was planning on leaving. It's not known whether Judith was aware what Riesenberg had done to cause him to be housed at Creedmoor. 5 years before they met, in 1971, 25-year-old Richard Riesenberg, an airline catering supervisor at JFK Airport, stabbed his wife Diane 60 times with such brutal force that some of her fingers were severed. He then went into their 17-month-old son Andrew's room, taped his mouth shut, and strangled him with an electrical cord. Riesenberg called police to their Queens apartment and said he came home from work and found his family dead. On a mirror in the house, scrawled in soap, was the message, "Death to all Jew lovers." Riesenberg was Jewish, Diane was Catholic. It's unclear whether this was intended to throw off the investigation, but police quickly focused on Riesenberg. Neighbors reported they argued often, he had multiple affairs, and the couple had sought counseling. One day prior to the murders, one of Riesenberg's lovers, a co-worker, had ended their affair. Riesenberg had a history of psychiatric illness, and although he reportedly had an IQ of 141, he was unable to complete school because of his mental health issues. He had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had attempted suicide twice before the age of 15. In one of those instances, he had written a similar message in soap on a mirror in his parents' home. Police searches of Riesenberg's apartment turned up nothing, but police turned to a landfill where trash from Riesenberg's work was taken and found a knife, extension cord, and a pair of underwear that connected Riesenberg to the scene. Riesenberg was arrested and admitted his culpability. He said he snapped due to a convergence of life stressors. He had been turned down for a promotion at work, he and his wife had religious differences, they argued over his affairs, and to complicate things, Diane was going blind from cataracts, and Andrew was developmentally challenged. A psychological evaluation of Riesenberg determined he was a paranoid schizophrenic who was incompetent to stand trial. He was sent for a year of treatment to a maximum security psychiatric facility, Mattawan Psychiatric Center. Then in 1972, Riesenberg was sent to Creedmoor Psychiatric Center in Queens. Doctors there assessed him and found him competent to stand trial. And after a bench trial for the murders of his family, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity. This from the New York Daily News, quote, Justice Bernard Dubin ordered him committed to a mental hospital and strongly recommended against any release, end quote. Creedmoor was a much more relaxed facility than Mattawan. It had thousands of patients, and many were permitted the freedom to come and go from the facility for limited amounts of time. After 2 suicide attempts, one of which required 37 stitches, Riesenberg seemed to settle in and began working in food services at the facility, making use of his catering experience. And like many other patients, Riesenberg left the grounds often, going to Mets games, restaurants, and so on. These outings were funded by Riesenberg's collection of proceeds from an insurance policy on his wife, which he was awarded after being found not guilty in her murder. Presumably, on some or all of these excursions outside the hospital, he spent time with Judith. Her first cousin recalls one occasion on which Judith brought Riesenberg to her aunt's house to be introduced to the family. Meanwhile, police started looking into Riesenberg in connection with some unsolved murders that possibly coincided with his excursions away from the hospital. A new supervisor at Creedmoor, alarmed by the police inquiry, finally decided to crack down on Riesenberg's freedoms and wrote a letter requesting his transfer to the Mid-Hudson Psychiatric Center, a maximum security institution. Riesenberg found out about the recommendation and walked out and never came back. Judith Brown disappeared around the same time. Detectives tracing Riesenberg's last movements noted that he had left with a 19-year-old girlfriend. It's unclear how they knew Judith had left with Riesenberg, but FBI agents visited Judith's family in Queens and informed them that Judith had left with her fiancé and their whereabouts were unknown. Judith has never been seen again. A few weeks after she left town, she did make one phone call to her family in Queens to let them know she was okay, but she has made no contact since. Riesenberg was last heard from in 1994, when he seemed to be considering a return to New York, but since that time, he has failed to surface. Judith Ann Brown remains a missing person. Her family does not believe that law enforcement is actively trying to find out what happened to her. Her sister Anne has searched for her online. She and another sister have submitted their DNA to the National Missing Persons DNA Database, part of CODIS. And Judith has been entered into NamUs, where she is profile number 3070. Judith Ann Brown is 5'4" tall, about 125 pounds, with sandy blonde hair and green eyes. She has an extra tooth on the bottom front row. Mike Morford sat down to speak with Judith's cousin Julian Quiterio to talk about her case. That conversation is coming up after a word from our sponsors.
Hi, welcome to the show, Julian, and thanks for coming on to talk about your cousin Judy's case with us.
Hi, Mike. Thank you. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to, talk about her and her story.
No problem. She's been missing now for years, and that's a long time to not know what happened to someone in your family. I'm curious, how hard was this for your family to go through early on and today, all these years later? I know you're sort of carrying on the fight to find out what happened, but what kind of ordeal has this been?
Well, sadly, it's this April 4th will be the 46th year since she's been missing. So it's been, it's been a little bit longer than that. It's coming up on 50 years, which seems surreal to me. I can say this, I was born after Judy disappeared. I was born in 82 and she disappeared in 77. So I never met her. And, for much of my childhood, I'd say up until about my teenage years, I didn't even really know about this story and what had occurred. And, as I got older, my mother eventually, maybe in my early teens, 14 or 15, told me about this. And, I was always the kind of person who was very curious and always asking questions. And, so I was just wondering what was happening with this case. And nobody really had any clear answers for me. But, at that age, I didn't have any, ability to do or say anything. So I just kind of left it at that, but always had like that curiosity with me. And around me, my family members really, they never really brought it up or spoke about it, so up until I'd say maybe 5-10 years ago when, I'm an adult and I finally started to, bring it up to different people, it was one of those subjects that was my family was very quiet about it. I wouldn't say that they would necessarily be very emotionally no, I absolutely don't want to talk about that. But a lot of them didn't really know what to say to me. And, unfortunately, a lot of Judy's family, as I grew up, they didn't live I grew up in New York with my mom and my grandmother and her family and my aunts and uncles. And the circumstances of the case is, Judy's family had moved to Kansas shortly before she stayed in New York. So I didn't really grow up knowing any of her siblings that well, or even her mother and father, and so I really didn't know much of anything. I know that, I more recently I had been talking to her. Now I've been in contact with everybody because it's so much easier these days. But I've gotten a bunch of letters that Judy had written in 77 and 76 to her family out in Kansas. And then after she disappeared, a bunch of letters that went between her mother and my grandmother in 77, kind of because my grandmother was here in New York, so her mother out in Kansas was trying to figure out what can we do, and it was really messy, and when I was going through those letters, it really started to become apparent to me how difficult it was for them.
Sounds like you sort of had to piece together sort of what they were feeling, what they were thinking by the letters from that time.
Yeah. Especially her mother, I never read any letters written by her father or any of her siblings, but I do know that her older siblings, Judy was one of 8 and she was the third oldest. So her 2 older siblings, She had particularly one that was here in New York while this all happened. She was, I think for her it was just awful because she was here, but she couldn't do much, and she was never really comfortable talking about it for decades and decades. And at some point, I was able to speak with her, and she was willing to speak with me because she knew what I was trying to do. And, she told me what she could, but, what I got mostly from it was that it was just extremely difficult to not know what had happened to her, combined with the person she disappeared with. There's that mystery. Sometimes I think in a cold case, like, is the person alive or not alive? And with Judy, it's even more of a mystery. Like, if anything could have really happened after her and this other guy left New York together. So there's really, there's no proof of life or death,
A lot of unanswered questions. And you brought up this guy that she left with, Richard. We'll get into him in a little bit, because the details in his backstory are pretty, scary as well. Before we get into the details of the actual disappearance, can you tell us a bit about Judy herself, what she was like, what she had going on in her life leading up to when she went missing?
Yeah, from what I have really gathered from everybody, it's very interesting because, like, I was not only investigating what happened to Judy after her disappearance, but her entire life and her personality from what I could get from all my family members, and even though I never met her, it feels like I know her or I knew her, and sometimes it's even difficult for me, like, to, kind of be working on her case, and I have to take breaks because it gets emotional, and she, as a child, what people would tell me is that she was a very quiet child. She didn't really cause much trouble. She was one of 8 siblings. Like I said, she was the third oldest. And, that she, I think, was very much like a typical child. She had her own little friends and sometimes, maybe she would be stubborn and get into small arguments with her parents, but like very, very normal type of childhood. And then as she got into her teenage years, members of my family started to describe her, some of her behaviors is becoming a little bit more strange, might be the right word for it. It started to become apparent that there were things changing in her that were not necessarily the same as everybody else. I don't know exactly what she had eventually been diagnosed with, but I do know she exhibited some like features of obsessive compulsive disorder and depression, and I don't know really where some of those things may have come from, but I think from her early teens she was struggling with them. I mean, not to a point where she couldn't function, because she did graduate high school, she got good grades, and she was a very straight edge person. I mean, that's kind of how most of my family, like, we were all raised. It's just we didn't really get into too much trouble because I think our parents would would give us a really hard time. So, Judy really just wasn't that kind of person to hang out with the wrong type of crowd. I don't even know if I don't even think she smoked cigarettes, or had experimented with drugs or anything like that. Like, I just really think that she was a very straight edge girl who just had friends, went to high school, and everything, was okay, except these personal struggles that she had. And I think they became more difficult as she, got a little bit older through her teenage years. And then, by the time she started going for undergraduate courses at LaGuardia Community College, they started to, they started to get a little bit worse. And that's sort of how the beginning of this whole disappearance, that's how it started, sort of with her mental health symptoms. But, I do know that she had a significant trauma in 1965, I believe. Her father had been hit as a pedestrian by a drunk driver, and he lived, but he had a very traumatic brain injury because when the car hit him, he hit a tree head first, and so he was very disabled and different after that, and her two elder siblings had, kind of moved away, and I think a lot of childcare fell onto Judy, because she had five younger siblings. And I think that was difficult, like that pressure of being there, helping take care of things around the house while her mother worked and her father was trying to find work. So she might have felt a lot of family pressure on her from that. But, I don't think they really argued over it. I just think I think that was a contributing factor to why, when her family decided to move to Kansas, she decided she was staying in New York.
Sure. And you mentioned her struggles with mental health. And that was a time when a lot of people didn't talk about that stuff, and a lot of people just bottled it up and didn't seek help, but she did seek help. And she went to a place that she checked herself into, which was called Creedmoor facility.
Yeah.
So she thought enough to check herself in there to try and get help. How long was she there once she went to the facility?
When she went to that facility, she had been driven there by one of her professors and one of my aunts in a car. And, the professor was driving, and my aunt had said when they arrived at Creedmoor, because that wasn't their original plan, I don't really think you should check yourself in there. She was a nurse at the time and, had an impression of what Creedmoor was like and what kind of patients were there. And for some reason, my aunt was like, Judy, don't check yourself in there. And Judy decided to, and she had checked herself in, I believe it was August 3rd of 1976. And by the 4th or the 5th, she was already transferred to Hillside Hospital by my grandparents. And she was willing, I think she just wanted initially to stabilize herself anywhere. And then once my grandparents and aunt expressed, we don't want you here at Creedmoor, they transferred her to another inpatient program at Hillside Hospital. So, strangely, she was only at Creedmoor for 24, 48 hours before she went somewhere else.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but the Richard that we talked about that's going to come up in this case, she met him at that original facility. Is that correct?
Yeah. Huh. She met him in that day or two somehow. Huh. In one of her letters, she says she met him at a bus stop, but I don't think that was true. I think she just met him when she was admitted into the facility, and maybe they just started talking that first or second day.
And eventually, Judy got out of the facilities. She got her own place. She was living with your grandmother, or with her grandmother, and she moved out and got her own place. How was she doing at that time once she sort of settled in into her own spot?
At that time, she seemed, the timeline is a little interesting. She was in the Hillside, inpatient facility until, I want to say, late 1976. I don't know her exact discharge date, but they transitioned her into an outpatient program that provided housing. But before any of that, she had lived with my grandmother, but once she went into Creedmoor that first time in August and then into Hillside, she never resided with my grandparents again. And then when she went into that outpatient housing, I think from what, I was told, she was doing fairly well. She was, in order to stay there, she wanted her own independence, obviously, to an extent, especially at 19. And I guess she wanted her own privacy. And I think, Richard, the man she was dating at the time, I think that was a big reason why she wanted more privacy, is to kind of keep certain things kind of to her, between him and her, and not involve my family as much. But she was writing letters constantly throughout that entire time. And, what I find interesting about that is, the letters were a lot of the time they were very positive. She never really expressed distress over much of anything. She even said at some point that her and Richard were engaged, and that they were planning on getting married, but she didn't specify when or where. And so, she didn't go back to school. She didn't go back to her undergraduate studies in psychology. But, I think she was very, enamored with Richard and their relationship. And I guess maybe in some, in a very happy sort of honeymoon period. And, there hasn't been really much indication that she wasn't doing well at that time. That maybe I know she was taking medications, but she was also talking to, different she had a psychiatrist and a psychologist, and she also had group therapy. So I think these things together were starting to help her a bit. But I also think her getting into a new relationship put her in an especially better mood, if you get what I mean.
Sure. And maybe she was hopeful and positive about this relationship, but the relationship wasn't a traditional one, in that Richard was, essentially confined to this place, to where Judy could go out and be free. He was confined to this place, and what he was in there for was obviously very serious. Can you talk a little bit about what Richard was there for and some of the details of how he came to be in that place?
Well, Richard Riesenberg was his full name. He was he was arrested in January of 1971 for killing his wife and his son. They lived in Glen Oaks, New York, and I guess on January 10th, sometime that evening, something happened where they had an argument and it got violent, and he stabbed her many times, and his son he strangled, and his child was 17 months old at the time. So it was particularly just disturbing to the neighborhood, his family, and obviously my family had nothing to do with this at the time, so it wasn't even on. My family never knew about this until after the fact, but and it was a big deal at the time. And he, at first, he tried to play it off as like he came home from work and he found them like this, and what happened, and the law enforcement believed him. But then as they put things together, they figured out it was him, and he was transferred to a psychiatric facility like in upstate New York until he could be brought before a judge. He was found like mentally incompetent to be brought before a judge immediately, because he was, according to the papers and other people I've spoken to, that he was so consumed with like shame, grief, and like regret about what had happened that he couldn't really function that well. They had to have him on constant suicide watch, and and it appears the way the events went, that he had some sort of psychotic episode or breakdown. I don't know from what specifically. Maybe the arguing just became too much, or something to that effect. But he had a history of mental health issues that date back to his early teenage years, 14, 15. He had multiple suicide attempts throughout his teenage years. And at the time he met Judy, he was 31, and she was 19, so he was a bit older than her. And he had more years to sort of struggle with his own mental health stuff. And then finally, when they found him competent, I think sometime in 72, just to stand trial, I think they did a bench trial. Like he didn't have like a jury. The judge just made a ruling, and the judge found him insane and had him, committed to Creedmoor inpatient, I guess, indefinitely. But he had already been in Creedmoor, because once he was found competent and this trial business started, he was transferred back to Queens, New York, so that he could be closer to the case and to the judge, obviously. And that's when things, after he was found insane and he was, in that, I never saw anything to say how many years, he had been given in the facility, but I would imagine it was indefinite to some extent. He started to establish a very comfortable relationship with the Creedmoor Psychiatric Facility, in the sense that when he wasn't having violent episodes, which were not often at all, he could have went a couple of years without one, and they were very unpredictable, it seemed. I don't know, but he presented as very high functioning. So he was able to start getting more and more privileges that other patients would never get, especially ones that, that were determined insane and had murdered 2 people.
So he had a little bit of a trust with them, to where they allowed him a little bit more freedom.
A little bit's putting it gently. I mean, he could basically during the day go out and do whatever he wanted.
Wow. Wow.
I'm sure he had a curfew. I don't know when that curfew was. I've heard as early as 4:35 p.m. or as late as 9 or 10 p.m. But he definitely wasn't allowed to stay over anywhere. Like, he had to be back there every night. But I've read articles about him, having gone to baseball games, going to see movies, and at the time going on dates with my cousin Judy and just gallivanting around New York like a member of the regular public, like as if he hadn't been, as if what had happened in 1971 never happened.
Wow. And it's that trust that he built up that allowed him to escape and disappear and at the same time as your cousin. Can you talk a little bit about that disappearance when he, went AWOL from the facility?
Yeah. He, my original thoughts had been, okay, at some point, law enforcement started to get the memo that this was going on with him. But, this had been going on with him, going around New York doing what he wanted for like 4 or 5 years, because he was in Creedmoor between, I think, 72 and when he escaped in 77, So, but then what started to happen is, and this was very popular at this period of time, especially like with the philosophy of psychiatry and psychiatrists at the time, that, pretty much anyone was capable of rehabilitation. And if they were deemed rehabilitated enough that, enough so, they could be, released from the facility back into the public with everybody else. And law enforcement, the DA, and the judge at the time in Queens, once they realized that the facility was kind of gearing up to assess his, rehabilitation and competency and all that, they were like, they felt absolutely not. You're not going to let him go anywhere. So they had decided themselves to transfer him back to the original facility in upstate New York. That would have been a lockdown facility that he probably would have never been able to leave from again. And I don't know, in terms of rehabilitation, how that would work at that facility, but that was a Mattawan psychiatric facility. And so they were going to transfer him back there, but someone in the facility actually tipped him off that this transfer was going to happen. And this is when he decided to, tell my cousin what was going on. Like, they're going to transfer me somewhere that I'll probably never see you again. So I have to run away. Will you come with me? And I guess the answer was yes, because she seemingly voluntarily went with him. And sometime in late April, I want to say, of 1977, I don't have an exact date on their disappearance, because NamUs says my cousin disappeared on April 6th, and all the records show that he escaped the facility on April 21st. So it's just really unclear. But after that, he kind of just, I want to say packed up his things, but he got his affairs in order and left with my cousin. And I would have said to myself, that I thought there was a relatively short period in which he would have been able to do this. But I've since spoken to other people, in his orbit that believe that he probably had been planning this before or right after he met my cousin, like planning on escaping at some point and getting his affairs in order so that, like, when he did, he was set up to do certain things. Like, at first I thought maybe it was like brief and messy and like, let's just get the heck out of here. But now I'm not so certain. He was a very smart man, and he was very clever, and he's also very manipulative. And I think he had been thinking about this for some time.
So he made his move, and he decided to ask Judy to go, and she apparently said yeah. Yeah. And when I was going to say, when did she goes missing? When did they put two and two together that they're together? And what happened early? Did they do any searches, or what happened with that?
No. They didn't do any searches that I know of in the typical sense of like a missing person search for, like, someone, a body or something. What happened is it got transferred to the FBI like extremely quickly, and it became about finding him as a fugitive. And from there, I don't have any of their files or notes. I'm still trying to see if, I think his case is closed, and it has been for some time. I don't, I guess because it's gone cold, but I don't have any of their files. So I don't know what they did, what they didn't do. But shortly, how my family found out she was missing was the FBI came to my grandmother's house and knocked on the door and said, "Hey, your niece went with this guy and disappeared with him." Like, they were kind of trying to see if my family had something to do with it, if they knew anything about it. And that's when my family was like alerted that she had went with him. So, we had been told from the beginning in April of 1977 by the FBI that she voluntarily went with him. And I don't know how, I don't know how they knew that, but I believe it to be true though. They were saying it, and I also have, reason to believe that she did go with him voluntarily.
And it's not like today where there's social media, stuff moves fast, fast as light. So by the time they realize that she's gone, he's gone, they've got time to get away and not have someone on their heels really quickly and be right behind them. A little bit of a head start, I think.
Yeah. I know that they were very, for what I know, they were very cautious or strict about, like, if once he didn't show up after a certain point one evening, they were already kind of like, okay, something's wrong. I don't think they waited very long, but I think whatever time they had, because of the leniency of him being able to be out for a majority of the day, a good 12 to 18 hours or more could have passed before they actually started like looking, and obviously like they were way behind, and, they were at that point, going to my family's house, his family's house, which was also nearby in Nassau County, New York, just asking them questions like, to the extent of like, do you know where he could have gone? Are you hiding him? That sort of stuff. And, I don't know how they got out of New York, but they could have used transportation, or they could have used a car. I believe he knew how to drive, but at the time when he was, inpatient at Creedmoor, he obviously didn't own his own car. So I questioned where he would have gotten a car from, and I have some ideas, but, I don't know. I really don't know how they went off, but if they were driving, they could have gotten even farther.
Yeah. So they could almost be anywhere and have that much of a head start. And here we have the news of a person that killed their wife and son on the loose, escaped from this place, could be dangerous. He got some attention, but Judy, the being with him really didn't get any attention. Her case wasn't really talked about. Why do you think that is?
I think it was a couple different reasons. I think first off, the way that they viewed her was a voluntary missing person, somebody, and, you're allowed to go missing if you want to. We've heard a million times, but there was no consideration at the time that, an endangered, vulnerable 19-year-old disappeared with a possibly homicidal 31-year-old. I mean, he had committed homicide in the past, but that means he could have been capable of it again at any time in the future. And especially if he was out of his facility and not being treated by anybody, like one can only think of what he could be capable of, and the most I could find about Judy was an article that said that he disappeared with his 19-year-old girlfriend, and they didn't even name her. So it was just very disheartening and sad to see that, that, I mean, they focused on him, and maybe their idea at the time was, if we find him, we'll find her. But
well, you think they would have put her name in there at least to say, hey, be on the lookout for her too, because if you find her, maybe you find him, they could be a package deal. So you think they would have put a little more information about her in there as well.
Yeah. It's a press. It was all mostly newspaper. I don't know like what came out on TV at the time, if much at all. I have no record of that. I do remember one of my family members mentioning to me that there may have been some posters like around the time that were in like the post offices. I think maybe like wanted, looking for both of them. Not necessarily that Judy was missing. And I guess, like I said, I don't think that the police or law enforcement had really much sympathy for her, because they felt like she was sort of like an accessory to him wanting to, I guess, escape, making the assumption that she knew everything that they knew.
Yeah.
Like they assume that she knew that he killed his wife and son 6 years prior. What if he never told her that? What if he just said, I'm in here because I had a breakdown, Yeah. So that's the part that kind of gets me, is like, I don't think there was any way for them to be able to prove that she was some sort of complicit accessory, whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
And then the mental issues as well. I'm sure a part of that was like, okay, well, this is some like, crazy girl who likes serial killers, or which he wasn't. I mean, he killed his family, but I don't think he killed other people. But like this crazy girlfriend that doesn't mind that her boyfriend committed homicide, so she's nuts, whatever. If we find her, we find her. She'll probably be with him. Let's focus on looking for him. That's kind of how the impression I got of it was, because there was no missing persons report on her until the 2000s.
Wow.
When and of course, my family had to do that themselves. It wasn't, automatically like generated, like, oh, it's just kind of like, yeah, she hasn't returned in like 30 years or so. So, can you guys help us figure out what happened to her? And yeah,
it's a real cold trail to try and follow. No sign of them. Eventually, it just goes cold, turns into a cold case. And then at some point there was supposedly a call from him to the facility sort of saying, hi, I escaped and I did this. When did that come? Do you know when that call came, and any more details about it? Was it really him? Were there any clues as to where he might be?
I only read about that in some, newspaper report that, that allegedly he called the facility. I want to say it was either several months later to a year later. It was not immediate, and it was to the Creedmoor facility to just basically boast that he was in California, but there's there's no proof that it was him and it wasn't a prank. There's no proof that if it was him, that he was even in California, just like trying to throw people off of his trail. So, no, I don't, I don't even know if that call even happened. I mean, if they were putting it in the paper, I would hope they were doing it based on something somebody at the facility told them rather than, trying to sensationalize the case.
Yeah. So not much value, nothing of significance came out. Were there any, ever any kind of sightings or leads or clues as to where they might be over the years?
The only thing that happened a few weeks after they left together is a family member got a call from Judy from somewhere, undetermined location, basically saying that, I'm all right. And, I'm okay. I just want to let you know. And that's it. The family member tried to get more information. Judy was very, cagey about it and wouldn't give any more information and just kind of hung up rather quickly or abruptly. And this was just a few weeks later. So I'm sure she might have been okay at the time. But my family has never heard from her again. Originally, I through my family's discussing this, I was under the impression that the phone call was a negative one, that she was like, I want to come home, I'm on my way back, whatever, I'll see you soon. And then she never showed up. But that actually, the person who got that call informed me that she actually said, I'm okay, I'm fine, don't worry about me. And just kept it like very open-ended like that. She's like, she didn't say anything like, oh yeah, have a nice life, or I won't see you guys ever again. She just was saying she was okay a couple of weeks later, but she kept it brief, and there's been no contact since that point, which I would imagine was still sometime in 1977.
So, the past, 4.5 decades, you've sort of had to, without much to work with, without any clues to go on, you've had to try and keep this case alive and get attention for it and put the word out there about your cousin. What kind of things have you done and what kind of challenges have you faced in doing that?
I'm trying to think where to start with that. I mean, the first thing I did was I went through. By the way, I'm an investigator in New York City. I work in criminal defense, so I'm not technically a private investigator, but I've been doing investigations for about 10 years now. I think March 1st will be 10 years. Well, and then I worked for a private firm before that, so maybe 11. And so I had some skills that I was able to kind of say, okay, I can start somewhere definitively and work from there. And the first thing I did was just went through my entire family, interviewing all of them and asking them what they may or may not have had in terms of evidence, anything, particularly I was looking for like letters, documents, pictures, things like that. And it turned out I came upon this treasure trove of documents and letters that my cousin Judy had written. She was writing these letters to her family in Kansas in 1976. Right around the time she met Richard, all the way up to April 4th was the last letter that I have of hers. And, Namath says that her disappearance date is April 6th, so it's just, and all these letters, like I said, they're very positive. they didn't really indicate any stress or that anything was going on that was concerning, except, that her relationship with him was building. They were planning on getting married, and it's unclear, if she even knew that he was capable of murder. And once I collected all those things and kind of made like a timeline of like when she met him and what Namus was saying and when they had disappeared, that's when I started to look at people outside of my family that may have had some information at the time. There were some friends that she had mentioned in various letters, that were friends with her at the time, and she graduated high school, which was, less than a year before. And some of those friends had went away to college in other states. So her contact with them at the time would have been limited, but I don't know which ones remained in New York and which friends didn't. So I still have some sort of possible witnesses that may or may not have bits of information. I really don't think they would have anything like gigantic to give me, but some of them have been hard to locate, or even to determine whether or not they're alive, because some of the names are more common than others. And it is New York City, so there's a lot of people here over the years. And yeah, so I still have a list of some of those people that I'm looking for, which would be some of her friends, and also like physicians and social workers and psychiatrists that were assigned to her back then, because I was able to find, not even through like FOIA or requesting documents, that my family had kept some of her paperwork from back in 1977. And, I have her last syllabus at her college, and I had a letter from Hillside Hospital, basically saying like, you haven't shown up for your appointments, and, you're in violation of your like program that makes us provide you housing. So if you continue to not show up, like, we're going to have to, evict you, and, you won't have housing here anymore. And then eventually, I think the last letter I have is April 28th of 77 saying, okay, you haven't shown up, and, we're going to give your housing to somebody else. So I was lucky to have like those things that people in my family just, I don't know how, but they had the presence of mind to keep for over 45 years.
Just so to help you have some kind of timeline of events and things like that.
And information. I mean, because on the documentation, from Hillside saying, talking about her housing, it had all of her like physicians' names on it, like her whole team, I guess, or whatever, like I said, a social worker, a nurse, and most of them are deceased, but some of them I can't confirm that yet. So I was, what I've been trying to mainly do right now, while I'm trying to get law enforcement back involved again, is at least interview and get what I can before like more people pass away and there's nobody to talk to.
Sure. And I mean, the time is of the essence in a case like this. It's that much time passing, and your efforts are going to help, keep her story out there, and maybe one day you could find her. And obviously you need some kind of help, you need tips, you need information. Is there any kind of websites or any social media pages, any place that people can go to, with tips or to learn more about the case, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. I made a Facebook page for her. It's called Judith Ann Brown Missing, Vanished with a Killer. I use her middle name because I've actually found other Judith Browns that have been missing in the United States. So I needed to distinguish between her and other people with the same name. And that Facebook page, I've made public, and I share on it as often as I can with new information, or I include maybe some other information about other, in missing persons cases. I just want to features to show support for other families, and anytime I have updates, like I said, it's on Facebook. It's called Judith Ann Brown Missing, Vanished with a Killer. And I also did a pretty thorough Reddit write-up about her on the Reddit page, Unresolved Mysteries. There's so many true crime ones, but they're a particularly large one. And if you just search her name, Judith Ann Brown and Unresolved Mysteries on Reddit, I did a pretty lengthy write-up about, it summarizing it. And like I said, in Facebook, I did that as well, except I also added more of the updates. And just getting, even if people don't have information, I've had so many people come to me with different skills and different things that they volunteered to help me that has been so helpful and incredible and amazing. People who are interested in genetic genealogy to, one other guy I met from Ireland who he's like a expert at making websites and things like that. And just people who really were like, I think I could help you in such and such a way. And being able to do that, being able to get that help has been great because, right now I'm the only person who's like actively working on this case. And it's very difficult to balance between like working the case itself, and trying to, put in all these requests for like FOIAs and everything else that I want to request. I also manage all of the social media myself, and I have to, and in order for it to get more traffic, I have to keep it updated, and how the social media works these days. The more you post, the more traffic you get, and then the more followers you get, the more popular it becomes. So it's kind of like that snowball effect. So I would just say, even just following her page, like really helps in a great way because it helps get her page featured more and more, just more, and the more people who see it, I'm hoping eventually it'll, especially with a lot of the emails and letters I've been writing, it'll come across someone's desks who is, who's in a position to help me, who will say, hey, you know what? Like, I'm interested in helping you.
Yeah. Or so maybe you never know. I was going to say, you never know. It could be, make its way in front of someone that, heard from them after they went missing or knew them, or someone might come forward and give you a little bit of a piece of a puzzle that can help you, figure out what happened to them.
Yeah. I'm hoping for any of those things, but what I've been seeing mostly is people that are just helping me to like work on aspects of the case that I guess I have left now that I need help with because I'm not strong in all areas, and also like people to help me navigate the relationship with law enforcement, or anybody in the FBI to start actively working on this again right now, because I can confirm that it's not actively being worked on by anybody except me.
And that's a uphill battle, trying to do all this on your own. It takes a team effort. And again, we'll do our part and get the word out there and help share the story and let people know that this case is still open, that your cousin is still missing. And hopefully, if anyone out there has any information, they'll do the right thing and come forward, maybe give you a tip or contact law enforcement. But I can't thank you for coming on enough to help us wade through this case, because there's a lot of information here, and not all it's been reported on, but you've helped us fill in the blanks. So thank you so much for coming on, and it was good talking to you, and good luck in searching.
Yeah, and thank you for just giving me the platform to to talk about her and her story, because in terms of cold cases and people being missing, like, I've done very little media before this. I've done one other, podcast, but these have been the first times I've been able to ever really officially put her story out there. So, I'm just very grateful and I hope I can kind of build more of this relationship with the public in general to have, to gain more interest for the case.
Well, keep up the good work, and again, we'll help do our part to spread the word.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Missing Persons. If you can provide any information to help solve the case we discussed in this episode, please contact the appropriate authorities.
If you enjoy this podcast, please take a moment to tell your friends about Missing Persons and invite them to listen to the show. Word of mouth will help us grow and bring these cases to a larger audience. You can also help us by taking a moment to rate and review Missing Persons on the platform you're listening to us now on.
We'd like to tell you a little bit about our Patreon program. If you visit patreon.com/missingpodcast, you can sign up to help this podcast through ongoing monthly support. As a thank you, we'll give you an on-air shout-out, a thank you card and sticker, plus you'll get early or ad-free access to episodes of the show and any bonus content.
Your Patreon support also goes towards helping the missing, because every dollar that we earn through Patreon will be split with charlieproject.org, the wonderful website that's been sharing information about so many missing persons cases for years. We hope you'll consider supporting the show. Just a reminder that new episodes of Missing Persons air every other Saturday. If you want to find us on social media, we're on Facebook at facebook.com/missingpersonspod. We're also on Twitter with the handle @missing_pod. And of course, you can find us and contact us through our website, missingpersonspodcast.com. On behalf of Jess Betancourt, this is Mike Morford saying thanks, and we'll see you next time on Missing Persons.